I need to tell someone about the mother who stole my childhood, and how I'm only now, at 32, beginning to understand the elaborate con she pulled on everyone around us. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in September, with me sitting cross-legged on the linoleum kitchen floor, carefully arranging my Lisa Frank stickers in alphabetical order while my mother sobbed into her coffee cup at the kitchen table above me. At 6 years old, I had already learned that the sound of my mother's crying meant I needed to become very small and very quiet, because sometimes her sadness would transform into something sharp and dangerous if I made too much noise. The phone call that would reshape my entire childhood came at exactly 8:47 a.m., because I remember staring at the digital clock on the microwave and thinking that the numbers looked like they were melting into each other through my mother's tears. Principal Henderson's voice carried through the receiver with the kind of authority that made my stomach clench, asking why I hadn't arrived at school yet, and my mother's response was a masterclass in manipulation that I wouldn't recognize for another 25 years. "Nora won't be coming to school today, or for the rest of the week," my mother announced into the phone, her voice suddenly steady and controlled in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. "We've had a family emergency, and I need her here with me right now because she's the only one who truly understands what I'm going through during this difficult time." The lie rolled off her tongue with such practiced ease that even I, at 6 years old, felt a strange mixture of pride and unease at being called so important and necessary. What I didn't understand then was that my mother had just written the first check in a transaction that would cost me my entire childhood, trading my education and innocence for her emotional comfort and practical needs. The family emergency was nothing more than another one of her depressive episodes, the kind that left her unable to function for days at a time, lying in bed with the curtains drawn while I tiptoed around the house like a ghost. But somehow, in her twisted logic, my presence had become the antidote to her pain, as if a 6-year-old child could somehow absorb the darkness that consumed her and transform it into something manageable. The house we lived in was a small, 2-bedroom rental on Maple Street, with peeling paint and a front porch that sagged under the weight of too many Ohio winters. After my father left, or was driven away, depending on whose version of the story you believed, the house seemed to shrink around us, becoming less of a home and more of a pressure cooker where my mother's emotions dictated the temperature of every room. The living room, with its threadbare carpet and mismatched furniture, became my classroom, where I learned lessons that no child should ever have to master. My daily routine during those lost school days followed a pattern that would become as familiar as breathing. Wake up at dawn to check if my mother was still in bed, tiptoe to the kitchen to see if there was anything I could manage to prepare for breakfast, and then spend the rest of the day walking on eggshells while trying to anticipate her needs before she even voiced them. The kitchen became my laboratory, where I conducted dangerous experiments with the gas stove, standing on chairs to reach the burners while my heart hammered against my ribs, knowing that failure meant my mother would sink deeper into her despair. "You're so mature for your age, Nora," my mother would tell me as I brought her toast cut into perfect triangles and tea steeped to exactly the right strength. "You understand me in ways that other people never could, and that makes you special, sweetheart. More special than any of those other children at school who are still playing with toys and thinking about silly things." Her words felt like warm honey coating my chest, filling me with a pride that I didn't understand was actually shame dressed up in pretty packaging. The phone calls from school became more frequent as the days stretched into weeks, and I watched my mother field each one with the skill of a seasoned politician, weaving stories about my fragile health and our family's unique circumstances. "Nora is going through a sensitive time right now," she would explain to teachers and administrators, "and she learns better in a nurturing home environment where her emotional needs can be properly addressed by someone who truly understands her special requirements." The adults on the other end of the line seemed to accept these explanations without question, perhaps because my mother had perfected the art of sounding both vulnerable and authoritative at the same time. What none of them knew was that behind the closed doors of our sagging little house, I was rapidly becoming the parent in our twisted relationship, managing not just my own needs but hers as well. I learned to read the subtle signs of her mood changes, the way her shoulders would tense when she was about to explode, the particular shade of gray her skin took on when she was sinking into one of her dark periods, the tone of voice that meant I needed to disappear for a few hours until the storm passed. My father's absence loomed over our house like a specter, and my mother's version of his departure changed depending on her mood and her audience. Some days, He was a cruel abandoner who had left us in our hour of greatest need. Other days, he was a weak man who couldn't handle the responsibilities of a real family. But late one night, when I was supposed to be sleeping, I pressed my ear against the thin wall between my bedroom and the kitchen and heard her on the phone with someone, her voice low and venomous as she described how she had made his life so miserable that he had no choice but to leave. The only light in those dark months came from my Aunt Ellen, my mother's younger sister, who would arrive unannounced with groceries and concerned questions that made my mother's jaw tighten with barely concealed irritation. Ellen had kind eyes and steady hands, and she never seemed to need anything from me except the occasional smile or honest answer about how I was doing. "How are you really doing, sweetheart?" she would ask when my mother was out of earshot, and the genuine concern in her voice made my chest ache with longing for something I couldn't even name. But my mother was masterful at keeping Ellen at arm's length, always having a reason why her visits needed to be short or why I couldn't spend the night at Ellen's house. "Nora and I have such a special bond," she would explain to her sister with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, "and I don't want to disrupt the healing process we're going through together during this difficult time in our lives." Ellen would nod politely, but I caught the worried glances she shot in my direction when she thought no one was looking. The night everything culminated in disaster, I was standing on a wooden chair in front of the stove, trying to flip grilled cheese sandwiches for our dinner while my mother sat at the kitchen table, lost in one of her episodes. The pan was heavier than I expected, and when I tried to turn the sandwich, hot grease splashed across my wrist and forearm, sending me tumbling backward off the chair with a scream that seemed to echo through the entire house. The burn was angry and red, already beginning to blister, and the pain was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my short life. My mother's reaction was swift and telling. Instead of rushing to comfort me or treat my injury, her first words were panicked, "Oh God, what if someone sees this and asks questions about why you were cooking dinner by yourself?" The fear in her voice wasn't for my pain or my safety, but for the consequences she might face if anyone discovered the truth about our living situation. She spent the next hour coaching me on what to say if anyone asked about the burn, creating an elaborate story about how I had accidentally bumped into her while she was cooking, how it was a simple accident that could happen to anyone. As I sat in my bedroom that night, my bandaged arm throbbing with each heartbeat, I pulled out the journal that Ellen had given me for my last birthday and wrote the words that would haunt me for the next 20 years. "I'm the only adult in this house." At 12 years old, I had been forced to confront a truth that most people never have to face. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you need protection from, and sometimes survival means accepting a bargain that will cost you everything you should have been allowed to keep. High school became my battlefield for survival, where I discovered that excellence could be both my salvation and my prison, depending on who was wielding it as a weapon against me. The burned wrist from that night in 6th grade had healed, leaving behind a faint scar that served as a daily reminder of the price I paid for my mother's emotional stability. But the real scars were the ones carved into my psyche by years of being told I was simultaneously the most important person in her world and completely powerless to leave it. My academic achievement started as a desperate attempt to create some corner of my life that belonged entirely to me, where my mother's chaos couldn't reach and where the approval I received wasn't contingent on managing her emotional temperature from moment to moment. Mathematics became my sanctuary because numbers didn't lie or manipulate or change their meaning based on someone's mood, and when I solved complex equations, I felt a brief glimpse of what it might be like to have control over something, anything, in my carefully orchestrated life. But my mother, with her uncanny ability to transform even my victories into her own personal triumphs, quickly recognized the potential for exploitation in my academic success. "Look at what an amazing mother I am," she would announce to neighbors, teachers, and anyone else who would listen, gesturing toward my report cards and honor roll certificates as if they were trophies she had personally earned through her superior parenting techniques. The pride in her voice when she spoke about my achievements was genuine, but it was the pride of ownership rather than genuine maternal joy, as if my accomplishments were simply extensions of her own identity rather than the fruits of my desperate labor. When I won the regional science fair during my junior year with a project on environmental chemistry that I had worked on for months in secret, staying late at school to use the laboratory equipment we couldn't afford at home, my mother's reaction was both predictable and devastating. "She gets all of this intelligence from me, you know," she told the local newspaper reporter who had come to interview me about the win, her hand possessively gripping my shoulder while she spoke. I was incredibly gifted when I was her age, before I had to sacrifice everything to become a mother and give up all my dreams for the sake of my family. The college application process became a covert operation that required all the stealth and planning of a military campaign, because I knew that my mother would view my desire for higher education as a betrayal of our special bond rather than a natural progression toward independence. I spent lunch periods in the guidance counselor's office, filling out forms and writing essays on borrowed computers, creating an entire parallel life where I was just another ambitious teenager planning for the future rather than a prisoner plotting my escape from a suffocating emotional prison. The night my mother discovered the acceptance letters I had hidden in a shoebox under my bed, her rage was unlike anything I had ever witnessed, even during her darkest depressive episodes. She tore through the carefully organized papers like a tornado, shredding scholarship notifications and acceptance letters while screaming about my ingratitude and selfishness. How I was abandoning her just like my father had, how I was destroying the family she had worked so hard to hold together. "After everything I've sacrificed for you," she sobbed, gathering the paper fragments in her hands as if she could somehow reassemble my future through sheer force of will. "This is how you repay me, by sneaking around behind my back and planning to leave me all alone in this world." The health crises began almost immediately after the college incident. Mysterious ailments that seemed to manifest whenever I showed signs of independence or attempted to make plans that didn't revolve around her needs and schedule. Sudden panic attacks would strike her whenever I mentioned working more hours at my part-time job. Vague but debilitating chronic pain would flare up whenever I spent time with friends, and emergency room visits became regular occurrences that always seemed to coincide with important events in my own life. My salvation came in the unlikely form of mandatory therapy sessions that began under the guise of treating my supposed test anxiety, a condition my mother had invented to explain my increasingly withdrawn behavior to concerned teachers and administrators. Mrs. Rodriguez, the school counselor who became my lifeline during those dark months, had a way of asking questions that made me think about my situation from angles I had never considered before. "Tell me about your home life, Nora," she would say during our weekly sessions, her voice gentle but persistent in a way that made it impossible to deflect with my usual responses about how close my mother and I were. It was during one of those sessions that I first heard the term, emotional abuse, applied to something other than dramatic television storylines, and the words hit me like a physical blow to my chest. Mrs. Rodriguez had been describing patterns of manipulation and control, painting a picture that felt so familiar it made my stomach churn with recognition. And when she looked directly at me and asked if any of these behaviors sounded familiar from my own experience, I couldn't find the words to deny what I had been living with for the past decade. The college acceptance that would change everything arrived on a Tuesday in March, a thick envelope from a prestigious university 3 states away that offered me a full scholarship and the promise of a life that existed entirely outside my mother's sphere of influence. I hid the letter for 3 weeks, reading it over and over again in secret, trying to imagine a world where I could wake up in the morning without immediately checking to see what kind of mood would determine the emotional climate of my entire day. When I finally gathered the courage to tell my mother about the acceptance and scholarship, her initial reaction was so calm and measured that I allowed myself to believe, for just a moment, that she might actually be proud of me and supportive of my decision to attend college. But that illusion shattered when she looked me directly in the eyes and said, with the kind of cold certainty that made my blood freeze, "If you leave me to go to that school, I will kill myself, and it will be entirely your fault because you chose some strangers over the mother who gave up everything for you." The next morning, she acted as if the conversation had never happened, cheerfully making breakfast and asking about my plans for the day as if she hadn't threatened to end her own life less than 12 hours earlier. The casual erasure of such a devastating moment felt almost worse than the threat itself, because it forced me to question my own sanity and wonder if I had somehow imagined the entire confrontation. My escape plan crystallized with the help of Aunt Ellen, who had been quietly documenting my mother's behavior for years and finally decided to take action when I called her, sobbing, the night after the suicide threat. "Pack only what you absolutely need," she whispered into the phone, her voice steady and determined in a way that reminded me that there were adults in the world who actually protected children instead of using them as emotional support systems. "I'll pick you up tomorrow night after your mother goes to sleep, and we'll figure out the rest together." The letter I left on my pillow the night before my high school graduation was 3 pages long, filled with explanations and apologies and desperate attempts to make her understand that leaving wasn't about rejecting her love but about saving my own life. I wrote about the burned wrist and the missed school days and the college applications she had destroyed, trying to help her see the pattern of damage that had shaped our relationship since I was 6 years old. But when I called the house a week later from Ellen's apartment, my mother answered the phone as if nothing had changed, asking when I was coming home for dinner and completely ignoring any reference to the letter or my reasons for leaving. College was supposed to be my fresh start, my chance to discover who I might have been if I hadn't spent my childhood managing someone else's emotions. But what I discovered instead was that 18 years of psychological conditioning doesn't disappear just because you change your zip code and sleep in a different bed every night. The academic part came easily enough. I had been an excellent student out of necessity for so long that maintaining high grades felt as natural as breathing. But the social and emotional aspects of university life might as well have been written in a foreign language that I had never been taught to speak. My roommate, a bubbly girl from Connecticut named Sarah who decorated her side of the room with photos of friends and family, would invite me to parties and study groups with the kind of casual assumption that I would know how to exist in these social spaces without feeling like an anthropologist studying an alien culture. "You're so mysterious, Nora," she would say with genuine admiration, completely unaware that my quietness wasn't an interesting personality quirk but rather the result of spending my formative years walking on eggshells and calculating the emotional cost of every word before I spoke it aloud. The relationship that nearly broke me happened during my junior year, with a graduate student in the engineering department who had kind eyes and steady hands and never once raised his voice during the 8 months we dated. He would bring me coffee during my library study sessions and listen patiently when I talked about my research projects, and his presence in my life felt like the first genuinely safe space I had ever experienced with another human being. But intimacy, I discovered, was a skill I had never learned. And every time he tried to get closer to the real me, I would find ways to sabotage what we had built together, picking fights over insignificant details and creating distance whenever the relationship started to feel too much like the kind of love that might actually last. The emails from my mother arrived like clockwork every few weeks, carefully crafted missiles designed to penetrate whatever emotional armor I had managed to construct during my time away from her influence. "I nearly died last week from complications related to my chronic condition," she would write, the words dripping with the kind of martyrdom that she had perfected over the years. "But I suppose you wouldn't know about that since you've clearly decided that your new life is more important than the mother who sacrificed everything to raise you properly." Each message was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, designed to make me feel simultaneously guilty for leaving and responsible for her continued well-being, even though I was living on ramen noodles and student loans 3 states away. Going no contact was one of the most terrifying decisions I had ever made, because it meant actively choosing to ignore the voice that had been the soundtrack of my entire life, even when that voice was poison dressed up as maternal concern. For 2 years, I changed my phone number twice and created new email addresses, building walls between myself and the woman who had taught me that love was supposed to hurt and that caring for someone meant sacrificing your own needs on the altar of their emotional instability. The call about Aunt Ellen's sudden heart attack came through the university's emergency system, because she had listed the school as her emergency contact along with specific instructions that I should be notified if anything happened to her. Ellen, who had been my lifeline during the darkest years of my childhood, died on a Tuesday morning while tending her garden, and the grief that hit me was complicated by the knowledge that attending her funeral would mean breaking 2 years of carefully maintained distance from my mother and the toxic ecosystem that surrounded her. The funeral became exactly what I should have expected it to become, a performance where my mother positioned herself as the primary mourner, despite the fact that Ellen had been estranged from her for years following my dramatic exit from the family home. "She always loved me best, you know," my mother announced to anyone who would listen, tears streaming down her face in a display of grief that seemed calculated for maximum impact rather than genuine sorrow. "We had such a special bond, and I know she would want me to be the one to carry on her memory and take care of all the family traditions she held so dear." What I learned later, through a cousin who had remained in contact with both Ellen and my mother, was that my mother had been telling people throughout our estrangement that I had joined some kind of cult that had brainwashed me into cutting ties with my loving family. Nora was always so impressionable, she would apparently tell neighbors and former teachers who asked about me, and these organizations prey on vulnerable young people who don't have strong family foundations to keep them grounded in reality. The irony of her portraying herself as the victim of my supposed brainwashing was almost too perfect, considering that she had spent my entire childhood conditioning me to believe that her emotional well-being was more important than my own basic needs. The phone call that changed everything came on a Thursday evening during my first year of graduate school, when a social worker from a hospital back in Ohio informed me that my mother had been found unconscious in her apartment and that I was listed as her emergency contact, despite the fact that I had never given permission for such a designation. "We need someone to make medical decisions for her," the social worker explained, her voice professionally neutral in the way that healthcare workers learn to deliver devastating news. "And she's been asking for you specifically, saying that you're the only family member she trusts to handle her care properly." Flying back to Ohio felt like traveling backward through time, returning to a place where the air itself seemed heavy with the weight of all the emotional manipulation and psychological damage that had shaped my childhood. The woman lying in the hospital bed looked smaller and more fragile than the towering figure who had dominated my memories for so many years, but even in her weakened state, she managed to deploy the same guilt and manipulation tactics that had controlled me for the first 18 years of my life. The conversation about the care facility was perhaps the first time in our entire relationship that I held all the power, and the role reversal was both terrifying and oddly liberating. "Please don't put me in one of those places," she begged, her voice cracking with genuine fear for perhaps the first time I could remember. "I promise I'll be better. I promise I'll change. I just need one more chance to show you that I can be the mother you deserve." But I had learned, through years of therapy and painful self-reflection, that promises from someone like her were just another form of currency in the economy of manipulation she had created around herself. Signing the papers that committed her to long-term care felt like the final act in a play that had been running for my entire life, and when the pen left the paper, I felt something inside my chest that I had never experienced before, the quiet satisfaction of making a decision based on what was actually best for everyone involved rather than what would cause the least immediate emotional upheaval. She cried and pleaded and deployed every guilt tactic in her considerable arsenal, but for the first time in my life, her emotional storms couldn't reach me because I had finally learned to build walls that actually worked. Walking through my childhood home for the last time was like touring a museum dedicated to my own psychological trauma, every room filled with memories of the ways I had been forced to grow up too fast and take responsibility for things that should never have been a child's burden. The kitchen where I had burned my wrist trying to cook dinner at age 12. The living room where I had learned to read my mother's moods like a meteorologist tracking dangerous weather patterns. The bedroom where I had written in my diary that I was the only adult in the house. All of it felt like artifacts from someone else's life. Someone I had been forced to be but was finally free to stop being. The only item I took from that house was a half-filled diary from when I was 10 years old, its pages containing the confused thoughts of a child who was trying to make sense of a world where love looked like control and care felt like suffocation. Reading those entries as an adult was both heartbreaking and empowering, because they served as concrete evidence of what had been done to me and proof that even as a child, some part of me had known that our situation wasn't normal or healthy. This part is about becoming a mother myself and confronting the most terrifying question of my adult life: what if I become her? Also, my father reappeared after 23 years, and what he told me changed everything I thought I knew about my childhood. Motherhood hit me like a freight train carrying every unresolved trauma from my childhood, because the moment I held Claire in my arms for the first time, I realized that I had absolutely no template for how to love a child without simultaneously destroying them in the process. Every milestone in her development became a minefield of anxiety for me, as I second-guessed every decision and analyzed every interaction through the lens of my own damaged upbringing, terrified that somehow the poison that had shaped my childhood would leak into hers despite my best efforts to contain it. Claire was 5 when the events of this chapter unfolded, a bright and curious little girl who approached the world with the kind of fearless enthusiasm that I had never been allowed to experience during my own childhood. Watching her explore her environment with complete trust that the adults around her would keep her safe was both healing and heartbreaking, because it showed me exactly what I had missed and exactly what I was determined to protect at all costs, even if it meant becoming somewhat overprotective in ways that sometimes concerned my husband and friends. The care facility where my mother now resided was one of those sterile, beige institutions that tried to mask the reality of human decline with cheerful artwork and motivational posters that fooled absolutely no one. Sunnybrook Manor was neither sunny nor particularly manor-like, but it was clean and adequately staffed, and my monthly visits there had become a ritual of dutiful obligation rather than anything resembling genuine filial affection or concern for her emotional well-being. My mother's condition had deteriorated in ways that were both predictable and surprisingly selective, because while her short-term memory had become unreliable and her physical health had declined significantly, her ability to deploy cutting emotional barbs remained as sharp and precise as it had been during my childhood. She would forget that I had visited the previous week but remember with crystal clarity every perceived slight or disappointment from decades past, wielding these memories like weapons during our brief, stilted conversations in her small room overlooking the facility's parking lot. The financial responsibility for her care had fallen to me by default, since there were no other family members willing or able to shoulder the considerable monthly costs of her residence at Sunnybrook Manor. I paid the bills without complaint or discussion, treating it as a kind of emotional insurance policy that allowed me to maintain the necessary distance while still fulfilling whatever obligations I felt I owed to the woman who had given birth to me, regardless of what she had done to me afterward. Our visits followed a predictable pattern. Would arrive with magazines she wouldn't read and flowers she would criticize, sit in the uncomfortable vinyl chair beside her bed for exactly 45 minutes, and endure whatever combination of guilt trips, manipulative comments, and selective amnesia she had prepared for that particular day. There were never any hugs exchanged, never any genuine apologies offered or accepted, just the hollow performance of a mother-daughter relationship that had been broken so thoroughly that we could only manage to go through the motions of normal familial interaction. The phone call that would change everything came on a Tuesday evening while I was helping Claire with her kindergarten homework, the kind of domestic scene that represented everything I had fought to create in my adult life. "Is this Nora Whitman?" the voice on the other end asked, and when I confirmed my identity, he continued, "This is Matthew Whitman, and I know this might come as a shock, but I'm your father, and I've been thinking about you for the past 23 years. Meeting my father for coffee 2 weeks later felt like stepping into an alternate dimension where everything I thought I knew about my childhood was suddenly cast in a completely different light. He looked older than I had expected, with gray hair and worried eyes that seemed to carry the weight of decades of regret, and when he spoke about the years he had spent wondering whether I was safe and happy, his voice carried a genuine pain that I had never heard from my mother in any of our interactions. "I didn't abandon you, Nora," he said, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if it were an anchor keeping him steady during this difficult conversation. "I left because your mother made it clear that my presence in your life was causing you more harm than good, and she convinced me that the best thing I could do for you was to disappear completely." The revelation hit me like a physical blow, because it meant that everything my mother had told me about his departure, that he was weak, selfish, unable to handle the responsibilities of fatherhood, had been yet another elaborate lie designed to isolate me further and cement her control over my reality. He told me about the custody battles she had threatened, the ways she had used me as a weapon against him during their relationship, and most devastatingly, about the times he had witnessed her emotional abuse and felt powerless to protect me without making the situation worse for everyone involved. "She would hurt you more whenever I tried to intervene," he explained, tears streaming down his face as he spoke. "And she made it clear that if I stayed and fought for custody, she would make sure that you paid the price for my interference in ways that would damage you permanently." The weeks following that conversation were a blur of therapy sessions and sleepless nights as I worked to reconcile this new information with the narrative that had shaped my understanding of my childhood for the past 3 decades. Every memory I had carefully catalogued and analyzed was suddenly suspect. Every moment of what I had interpreted as my mother's desperate love was now potentially evidence of calculated manipulation designed to maintain her absolute control over my emotional and psychological development. The comment that crystallized everything happened during one of my routine visits to Sunnybrook Manor, when I overheard my mother speaking to one of the nurses in the hallway outside her room. "My daughter ruined me, you know," she was saying, her voice carrying the same self-pitying tone that had been the soundtrack of my childhood. "Everything that went wrong in my life can be traced back to having to sacrifice my dreams and ambitions to raise that ungrateful child." When the nurse later mentioned this conversation to me, asking if there was some family issue she should be aware of, I found myself responding with a calmness that surprised even me. "She says that a lot." The temptation to simply stop paying for her care and walk away from the entire situation was overwhelming during those dark weeks when I was processing everything my father had revealed about our family history. I spent hours lying awake at night, calculating the financial freedom I would gain and the emotional relief that might come from finally cutting the last thread that connected me to the woman who had damaged me so thoroughly during my formative years. But instead of abandoning her, I found myself doing something that felt both generous and vindictive at the same time. I upgraded her to a private room with a window view and better amenities, not out of love or forgiveness, but out of a strange combination of pity, guilt, and a desire to feel absolutely nothing at all toward the woman who had once been the most important person in my world. The gesture felt like a final payment on a debt I wasn't sure I actually owed, a way of ensuring that when she eventually died, I would have no regrets about the level of care I had provided, regardless of what she had done to deserve or not deserve such consideration. The moment that broke me completely happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon when Claire was playing in her room and stumbled across the old diary I had taken from my childhood home years earlier. "Mommy, what's this?" she asked, bringing the small book to me with the kind of innocent curiosity that children bring to everything they discover in their exploration of the adult world around them. Reading those entries aloud to my daughter, the confused thoughts of a 10-year-old child trying to make sense of a world where love looked like control and care felt like suffocation, finally broke through the emotional armor I had been building around myself for the past 2 decades. The words on those pages, written in my own childish handwriting, were like messages from a little girl who had needed someone to save her, and as I read them to Claire, I found myself crying for the first time in years, mourning not just for the childhood I had lost but for the innocence that had been stolen from me before I was old enough to understand what was being taken away.